Good afternoon. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars here at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this special presentation. And now for a discussion afterwards. We do have microphones for those who will be asking questions. Let me give you a little more background on Charlotte, who works for us here as she presents the rest of this program. Charlotte Florence is our Research Associate for Economic Freedom in Africa and the Middle East. She studies our U.S. policy toward Africa and the Middle East, concentrating on economic freedom, democratic institutions, development, and security cooperation. Before joining us here, she was a research fellow responsible for international security and foreign policy issues on the Federal Financial Management Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. She previously worked in Kenya with a local Catholic Relief Services partner organization, St. Joseph's Shelter of Hope, as a program assistant. They concentrated on sustainable alternative livelihood projects for individuals who tested HIV positive under the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. In addition to Kenya, she has been in the United Kingdom, traveled extensively in more than 30 countries, and holds a master's degree in conflict, security, and development from the War Studies Department at King's College. Charlotte, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, John. I'd like to now introduce our special guests for the sake of time, because I know we are limited. And I'll have them share a bit about their work, and then we can open up to the floor for questions. First, Jeff Smith comes to us from the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights, where he is an advocacy officer with the RFK Center's partnership with 2009 Human Rights Award laureates Magondonga Malangu.
You got it.
All right. Yeah. And Women of Zimbabwe Arise. Mr. Smith works closely with civil society leaders and human rights defenders throughout Zimbabwe to actively promote respect for human rights and advocate for a peaceful democratic transition. Mr. Smith has a decade of experience in human rights and democracy promotion work, including prior positions at Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Institute for Democracy in South Africa, and the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization. He has also conducted human rights assessment missions in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya. Mr. Smith has appeared as a commentator on several radio programs and in a range of publications, including Voice of America, Shortwave Radio Africa, Radio France International, Thomson Reuters, The Atlantic, and The Guardian newspaper. Jeff Smith received his master's degree in international relations and was the University of Connecticut's first recipient of its Distinguished Human Rights Graduate Certificate. And of course, Laurie Conway, the film's writer, director, and producer. Laurie Conway is an independent producer and filmmaker for Boston Film and Video, a firm she started in 2000. Apart from Beatrice Mtetwa and The Rule of Law, Ms. Conway also produced and directed Forgotten Ellis Island, which was the recipient of 3 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Some of her past work includes The Incredible Voyage of Bill Pickney, for which he received the Peabody Award and the Cable Ace Award, and Fortunate Son, which received the Columbia University DuPont Award. Laurie Conway has also produced numerous short films and videos for Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, the Neiman Foundation, and Gender Health, a leading international nonprofit, and others. For 12 years, she was a staff producer for Chronicle, a nightly news magazine. Ms. Conway also held one of Harvard University's Neiman Fellowships in 1993 to 1994 in recognition of her work. I will now turn it over to Laurie.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you all for watching the film. It's really been a labor of love and a privilege for me to be working on it with Hopewell Chinono and Andrew Meldrum. To me, there are 3 primary goals behind this film. First, to direct attention to human rights, and particularly to legal action in support of human rights, and to do so in a way that humanizes the issue. There are articles and books on human rights and the rule of law, but they convey the message in a more abstract way, I believe, than films can. And I've been inspired during the screenings by the number of people who have come up to me afterwards after watching the film and tell me they now get it about the rule of law in a way that they had not really appreciated before watching the film. Moreover, even though the focus is Zimbabwe, the problem is a much wider one, and so is the need to extend the film's reach. The second goal is to educate people, particularly young people in countries where the rule of law is not institutionalized, on why the rule of law is the foundation of a civil society and a fundamental component of democratic and economic development. Without the rule of law, there is no foundation from which to achieve progress. This process, getting people to embrace the rule of law as a basic value, is a lengthy one and beyond the scope of any single book, film, or organization, but I believe our collective efforts together can make a difference in the long run. The third goal is the one that I've come to more recently than the other two, which were part of my thinking since the beginning of the project. And this goal is to make Beatrice Mtetwa more widely known. In choosing to build the film around her, I thought she would be a compelling figure. She's that and more. She's inspiring, smart, courageous, and ethical. I've been struck at each screening of the film by the number of people who come up to me and tell me how inspired they are by Beatrice. She's one of the role models for a new Africa. The fact that she's a woman is a plus. I think she has a special capacity to help women of Africa of all ages, but especially the younger ones, to consider how they can contribute to the public good. And Beatrice is an example by which others, young and old, male and female, can measure their country's leaders and ask of them the same standards of conduct that she exemplifies. For these goals to be realized, it's important to get the film to as large and broad an audience as possible, which is why screenings and distribution are a necessary part of the strategy. I've been working steady over the last several months on screenings and distribution issues, and I've achieved some success. We've had screenings all over the world, and I'm organizing more because much more can be done in the coming months. I've been in talks that show promise with organizations like Freedom House, the RFK Center, and Open Society of Southern Africa to find ways to distribute the half-hour version of the film and accompanying educational materials to secondary schools, as well as colleges and civic-minded organizations such as local bar associations in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're also working within Zimbabwe itself to have screenings for citizens in the rural areas who do not have access to the film through the internet or television. So filmmakers spend much more time fundraising than they do anything else, and that's the focus of my efforts right now, finding support to get the film out there as widely as possible. Fox Africa has just agreed to broadcast the film to their vast audience in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're lining up broadcasts with networks around the world. Thank you again for your interest. Please go to the website ruleoflawfilmproject.com, and from there you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and I'll be happy to answer questions after Jeff.
Thanks so much, Larry. I'm so tempted to sit here and just recount some great anecdotes that I have with Beatrice over the past 4 or 5 years that I've known her. But what I'm going to do really quickly is just sort of give a quick up-to-date update on the current context in the country. As many or most of you know, we're 2 days out from potentially watershed elections that break the deadlock from 2008 and 2009. The last time, or one of the last times I saw Beatrice actually was in the Harare High Court in March of this year, where she, prior to that, had been held for 8 days after allegedly obstructing the course of the work of police in Zimbabwe. She had the audacity to ask for a search warrant for one of her clients. His house was being ransacked. And in the court, we were actually there. The RFK Center had led and organized an international delegation to Zimbabwe because we had many lingering and ongoing concerns about the human rights environment there. So we were fortunate enough to be there, along with many eminent international people that were part of our delegation, including Ms. Alfre Woodard, who is here today, human rights activist and actor extraordinaire. So thank you so much for continuing to be a part of this effort to raise awareness about the goings-on in Zimbabwe. A lot of people focus on the negative, on the negative aspects in Zimbabwe, and I think this film really does a good job to show that there are people out there like Beatrice who are champions for human rights and the rule of law, and they won't be silenced. And as many of you know, too, in May, there was a long-awaited constitution that was finally signed into law. It says, it speaks a lot to the rule of law and to human rights. It's very powerful and very strong in terms of women. There's going to be a newly created gender commission. There's going to be proportional representation for women in parliament, all of which are certainly great advancements. But as you heard Beatrice say in the film, no one is using law to bring the current madness to an end. And typically it takes upwards of a decade or more if you do comparative studies around the world to actually see the culture of constitutionalism take place. So we're all waiting anxiously for that to happen. Going quickly to our delegation, we really had three key findings that I'll sort of go over quickly. We do have some hard copies here for anyone who's interested, and it's also available to download in full on our website as well. And the key thing that really you saw come out in the film is the monopoly of power and influence that ZANU-PF continues to maintain over key instruments of power in the country, and that's the police, the security sector, and the military. Essentially, the military is ZANU-PF, and ZANU-PF is the state. Partisanship of the police is still rampant. Even leading up to the elections, there's routine blocking of opposition political rallies, or they often use the excuse that there's a shortage of staff, and therefore police can't be on hand to safeguard the safety of everyone there. And anyone who has the audacity, like Beatrice, to speak to the rule of law and to speak to Zimbabwe's domestic, legal, and international legal obligations, they're necessarily branded enemies of the state and agents of the regime change, and therefore the police are able to treat them accordingly. To this day, amendments to repressive laws, as you saw Andrew Meldrum, and the very tight draconian media law that's in place have stalled. And there's little chance of reform before elections, given that they're 2 days out. Just to give one example, one notorious piece of legislation is called the Public Order and Security Act, which essentially forbids any criticism of the president or the office of the president. Since 2010, there have been 60 Zimbabwean citizens charged under this crime for allegedly insulting the president. And only 2 of those have been convicted. One of them, ironically enough, was Robert Mugabe himself during the Rhodesian regime. Then it wasn't called the Public Order and Security Act, of course. It was called something else. And also you saw in the film the very brave women of Zimbabwe arise. Since their founding in 2003, Jenny Williams alone, their founding director, has been arrested 53 times and never convicted of a crime. So leading up to elections during our delegation and since, and we've also seen increased intimidation, not surprisingly threats, and in some instances violence against civil society. Since August 2012 of last year, when we really saw election-related rhetoric start to pick up, there's been almost 24 civil society organizations that have either been broken into by the police, equipment and materials seized with no legal reasoning or backing, or leaders spuriously charged with crimes. This has been particularly evident on organizations, again, not surprisingly and unfortunately, engaged in voter registration and voter mobilization. And we've also, coinciding with this, we've seen a very devious strategy on the part of the police this time around is targeting what I like to call safety net organizations. For instance, in November of last year and several times since then, there has been raids and arrests on one organization called the Counseling Services Unit, a nonpartisan, completely apolitical organization that merely provides support, whether medical or psychological support or treatment to victims of political violence or police torture. And they've been a routine target of this repression, including lawyers now, with the arrest of Beatrice Mtetwa, as well as Zimbabwe Peace Project, which has been raided a number of times. And that organization simply documents police malpractice in the country. One of the second key finding we found was continued violations of rights to freedom of expression, which we also heard about from the journalists in the film, and access to information. One really interesting and unfortunate event happened in February of this year when the Deputy Police Commissioner came out and publicly banned shortwave radios, which have essentially been deemed weapons of mass destruction in Zimbabwe. As you may know, Zimbabwe is a mainly rural population. Essentially 65% of the people live outside of urban centers, and they rely on these radios to receive any semblance of free or outside information, because the mass media holding company in Zimbabwe, which is controlled by the government, operates the 2 main daily newspapers, as well as Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation. So these were banned. And in and of itself, the banning of shortwave radios is not going to sway the election one way or the other. I'll certainly admit to that. But if your family in the rural area survived the genocide that happened in the 80s, you survived post-election violence in successive elections, including 2009, and then the police come and knock on your door and forcibly confiscate your shortwave radio, I'm sure that's going to play on your mind and potentially deter you from going out to vote. Also, just this past week, on July 26th, the government blocked all mass SMS bursts or text messages that many civic organizations use to to get out information to the populace. This has now been blocked by the government, and essentially, this is the most effective way to disseminate information for many civic groups, and that will not be taking place up until elections. And just really quickly, we're talking a lot about intimidation and harassment and violence, but just to take election mechanics really quickly. And a lot of people are rightly raising the point that this time around, there hasn't been a lot of violence, certainly relative to 2008, 2009, that's true. But what ZANU-PF has done very cleverly is done a number of things to peacefully rig the election potentially in their favor. And one way they have done this is really manipulating the voters' roll in Zimbabwe. And a number of worrying pieces of information have recently come to light. Number one of which is 1 million people on the current voters' roll are either deceased or no longer living in Zimbabwe. 63 constituencies have more registered voters than inhabitants, and upwards of 100,000 voters on the current voters' roll are aged over 100 in a country that has an average life expectancy of 51. There has also been 4 or 5 different versions of the voters' roll that has been released, and still to this day, the final version of the roll has not found its way into the hands of the opposition parties, nor has the public disclosure of polling stations been announced. So people oftentimes will not even know where to go to vote 2 days from now. All this obviously amounts to massive breaches of domestic law, not to mention international law, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the SADC guidelines governing democratic elections, all of which are clear violations of these. And I don't want to forecast the elections too much or get too much into political analysis, but the fact that the voters' roll is in shambles, the security forces are unreformed and openly campaigning for ZANU-PF, including brigadier generals and generals. The media obviously remains partial to the former ruling party, and the Electoral Commission is vastly ill-prepared, and allegations of peaceful rigging pervasive. Many believe, and would think right to believe, that the elections are not going to be in any way credible, free, or fair. So not to put too much of a dour spin on things, but that's currently where things stand. I don't want to talk too much, and I would love to ask any or answer any questions that anyone may have.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Lori. Now I'd like to open it up to the floor to ask questions. If you can please identify yourself and your affiliation, and I'd also ask that you actually ask a question, not a statement, again, because of time. All right, take this gentleman up here in the front, or behind here. Yeah.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler. Can you just tell me why the government pretends, why do they even bother to arrest people and not just shoot them at home or whatever else they might do?
Sure. I think to answer that question is that the government, obviously, to my mind, ZANU-PF and President Mugabe, they don't want to be a pariah state any longer. They want to be included in the international community. Zimbabwe is one of the richest countries in terms of natural wealth in the world. They have, between them and South Africa, they have 90% of the world's platinum reserves in the world, 90%. They've recently discovered the largest alluvial diamond field ever discovered in the world. They want to be involved. They want to be involved in the international community. And what they've done, which is very clever, is that there's always this veil of democracy. You heard Beatrice say it herself. They don't just go to your house and beat you up or shoot you, as you grimly said. But they make a law and make it legal to persecute you by prosecution. You've seen it over and over and over again. So, while there's this veil or this veil of legitimacy, once you start peeling back the layers and you start paying a bit more close attention as to what's actually happening, these more dubious conclusions, you start to come to those. And I think it's for the sake of having some sort of international legitimacy and not having the violent landscape that they had in 2008 and 2009.
Here in the front.
Robert Mugabe is around 85 or something like that years old, really old.
89.
89. So I mean, what is number one? What does this guy have to gain by being a greedy dictator when he's so old? And number two, is there any idea who he's going to take his place when he passes away? Are there dictators waiting in the wings?
Well, I think he prides himself on noting to crowds that his mother lived to be 105. And so I was with Beatrice 2 weeks ago in The Hague. We did a screening there as part of the World Justice Forum, and I asked her about what will happen if he does get reelected and say he were to die, or if he were to be killed, or any number of scenarios. And she said, according to this new constitution, the vice president, Majuro, would become president. And you know more about Majuro than I do, but let's just say that she's been around the Mugabe circle for decades. So we know that while she may not be Robert Mugabe, she's certainly a daughter of his ideology. And so I don't know how much better it would be.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things there, and I think Mugabe still certainly maintains a lot of obviously maintains executive control over the country, but he also has a very strong and influential group around him, comprised of the military leadership, of the police, and of the security sector. And there's really two key things. There's two key things there. Number one, these people, including Mugabe himself, for having command responsibility over all of this, is they want to protect themselves from any potential criminal accountability for these massive, and in some cases, crimes against humanity that they've committed. So they want to stay in power and have that immunity. And secondly, it goes to a point I made when answering the first gentleman's question, is that these people want to preserve and maintain the massive amounts of wealth that they've been able to accumulate over the years. If you take the diamond fields alone in the eastern part of the country, in Merengue, in Chiadzwa, the estimates vary, but we've seen estimates upwards of $2 billion of diamonds that have already been extracted and exported. So you take that, and I'm not saying that's an accurate number, because like I said, they vary. It's anywhere between, $500 million to $2 billion. But of that money, only $45 million has gone through Treasury. So where's the rest of that money going? One clue is if you look at the current mines minister, who's a very powerful and high-ranking ZANU-PF official, is now currently one of the richest men in southern Africa. He's bought all of Bulawayo, the second largest city in the country, and essentially all of Victoria Falls, which we all know as one of the most beautiful areas in the world. And also Mugabe has purposely not addressed the succession issue within his party, and that's always the proverbial elephant in the room that has not been addressed, to the detriment not only of the party but the country itself.
Take the one in the back over there.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the farmland and what the possibility is of them ever being returned to their previous owners and going back to these thriving, productive places that they used to be? Is there any speculation or chance of that happening?
Well, I mean, I'm more anecdotal from what I've heard about from Roy Bennett and people like Sternford Moyo, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff. But, I don't think it will ever go back will ever be returned to the original white owners. I think there will be some kind of land redistribution, whereas Roy is a citizen of Zimbabwe, just like any black Zimbabwean. He was born and raised there as a third-generation farmer. But I do believe that the land redistribution will come about in such a way that will divide up the property, including his. That's probably, he holds the contract to it, the title to it. But I don't see that ever happening because the need to do sort of an overall land redistribution program to, create some sense of equity amongst those who at one time might have owned that property. So I don't see it going back the way it was. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, nor does he. And it was so interesting to me to hear Heather, his wife, say, I don't care about the material, and she meant it, and so does he. I think they just want, and Roy is working very hard. In fact, Roy was going to be here today, but because the election is in 2 days, he couldn't make it. But if there is what we assume to be a fixed election and an illegitimate one, and it's going to be, there'll have to be some kind of a runoff, there is possibility that he will come back to Washington and just start raising more awareness between now and August, end of August. But I'm going to let Jeff, because he's certainly more of the scholar when it comes to these what ifs than I am.
Yeah, and I think the land reform issue is obviously a very touchy issue, not only in Zimbabwe but South Africa and across Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think land reform, in theory, or land resettlement, is a great idea. I mean, it's necessary. It's a moral necessity and it's a political necessity. In Zimbabwe, essentially 400, anywhere between 400 and 600,000 landless blacks have been given the opportunity to access this land, and to use it, and to access it, and to not just use it for subsistence farming, but to use it to sell and to have as a business. However, the land reform project has not been implemented in a very constructive way. There was massive violence and displacement of the current or of the former owners, and that not only, you saw in the film, so clearly depicted, not only hurt the commercial white farmers, but also the hundreds of thousands of black laborers that relied on that for their living, not only for them but for their family and their extended families in a lot of cases. But I think it's also important to remember too, the land reform issue is that when Mugabe came to power, he it said routinely and consistently that was going to be sort of a pillar of his administration turned regime, but consistently didn't act on it. It wasn't until the war veterans who fought for liberation and achieved independence started rioting and invading the farms on their own without directives from President Mugabe that then the ZANU-PF came in and took over and directed that violence and the forcible takeover of land. And it was after ZANU-PF, and this is documented, and that you can read the report, that there was a war victims compensation fund set up to pay the war veterans so they could, so people that participated in the liberation war. It had been thoroughly looted by ZANU-PF, and that's why they were so angry. So a lot of people forget that Mugabe wasn't the one who actually initiated this whole land fast-track resettlement program. It was actually the angry war veterans who weren't getting what they thought they should have received from participating in the liberation war. So I think that's an important fact that a lot of people tend to forget.
Yeah, I think the big concern is that when this land redistribution program gets put into place, it has to be done within the rule of law. It was just so lawless and so violent before. And I would, if Roy were here, I would be very curious to hear what he would say, but I would venture to think that he would, knowing him a little bit, he would probably agree that there has to be a more equitable form of redistribution of that.
And I think when as you know, when all the violence started happening, the commercial white farmers became a very convenient and expedient scapegoat for Mugabe, because, as I said, the party, and again, this is fact, it's documented, that the compensation fund was completely looted by ZANU-PF officials, and that's what really sparked all this outrage. Only then did the party and did Mugabe come in and sort of take control and take ownership of all of that anger, and then directed the anger away from them and towards commercial white farmers, which became the scapegoat, essentially.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions, so take one over here, and then the gentleman in the back.
My name is Duncan Spencer. I'm here as a guest of Alfred. The judiciary seems to be one bright spot in the movie, and I don't quite understand how they could have withstood the general corruption and the control of the government. Your heroine obviously plays against that background. Could you explain?
Well, there are plenty that have been corrupted, and as you heard Beatrice say, they don't have the bravery that she has, and they have families that they worry about. However, she does win a lot of cases, and that's because there are some, as she would say if she were here, they're not crooked. They do believe in doing the right thing, and they're trying to work within a system that is all about the wrong thing. And so, there are some unsung heroes in that judiciary who, as she would say, attempt to uphold that tattered, mutilated constitution that they had before this new one. And yet, when Jeff was in Zimbabwe with Alfred, heard the denial of the bail that Beatrice, was getting refused twice, and then the third time, a different judge ruled that yes, you could be allowed out after 8 days in jail on $500. Well, that judge has been harassed. She said he's scared for his life because of his behavior in making that ruling. He's become a target of the ruling party. And so, that's just has such a chilling effect. And as the young Giff Peary journalist said to me, because I asked him about the impact of all of this censoring on his journalism and in his writing, and he said, well, we all just self-censor. That's what happens. Even though he went back to work after that horrible beating, he said he just doesn't write the way he used to. And how could he? After 5 days, you saw the footage that was, that footage was squirreled out of the country. And the man who shot that, I couldn't give him a credit. There are many of those images in the film. I couldn't credit who took that footage because they're so fearful. So there are courageous people within that judiciary trying to do the right thing, but they also know they'll pay a price.
Hi, my name is Tendai. Actually from Zimbabwe, and Beatrice is my mom's friend. But I guess I had a question. I'm pretty hopeless about the election coming up as well. What kind of policy steps do you think can be taken here in the United States in the event that Mugabe gets back into power? And what role do you see the film playing in kind of influencing policy and influencing how legislators here approach the problem?
I'll very quickly just say that I have been referring to the film as making a ripple of difference. And somebody within one of the minister's office sent me an email last week and said, no, Lori, it's making a waves of difference. It's not just a ripple. So I was thrilled to hear that. We'll continue to do as many screenings as we can raise money to, have people host screenings to raise awareness about the conditions and get people engaged. But in terms of actual policy, in terms of sanctions and engagement on...
Another easy issue.
Yeah.
That's an easy one. Yeah, no, I think it's not a question of whether Robert Mugabe prevails on July 31st or thereafter. If the election result, I'm gonna sound like a politician now, God. If the election result represents the will of the people, then that's something we have to respect. But again, you can't base an election on the so-called gold standard of having less violence than 2008 and 2009. And I think, if you start peeling back all those various layers of legitimacy, you start seeing a lot of these problems. For instance, if there's nothing to hide, then why forbid international election observers? Why prohibit the Carter Center, which has observed elections all over the world, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southern Africa? Why bar them? Why not allow them to come in? But at the same time, invite your friends from Venezuela, China, Russia, Belarus to come observe the elections. I mean, that certainly raises some eyebrows. If you're confident in winning, why frustrate the registration exercise of registering new voters? Why are there 2 million unregistered youth voters from urban areas in the country that are traditional MDC strongholds? Why have they not released a location of a vast majority of the polling stations? Why have they taken away a number of upwards of hundreds of polling stations in urban MDC strongholds? They're no longer on the map. They're no longer there. If you're confident in all these things and you're confident that your policies are best for the country and will advance the country further, then why take all these steps to frustrate the process? And I think one thing, to answer your question more directly, that the U.S. could do, it's really difficult for the U.S. to come out and say anything, right? Because we're just be labeled as neo-imperialists and neo-colonialists and that whole gamut that Mugabe and ZANU-PF love to be for the past 33 years. So one thing we can do is work through regional, the Southern African Development Community. And I think one key thing, it sounds so simple and I still don't understand why it can't be done, is that SADC as the regional bloc has principles and guidelines that govern democratic elections. So that's supposed to be the blueprint for, everyone's always talking about, oh, what defines a free and fair election? What defines a credible election? They have the document, it's right there, and they're obliged to follow that. So my point is, why can't the U.S. talk behind the scenes or urge SADC as the guarantor of the GPA and as the guarantor of these elections to come out and publicly certify that the conditions on the ground are consistent with the principles in that document. I think that would be a key first step. You could say the same thing for the African Union and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The only problem with the African Union, of course, is that they've never not rubber-stamped an election. So therein lies the problem. So organizations like that, the Gentlemen's Clubs, the AU and the SADC, with the exception of President Banda from Malawi, prefer the status quo. They don't want anything to change. And Zimbabwe's not an outlier in that regard. If you look at the Southern Africa region, all the liberation parties that came to power after the Liberation War in Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, South Africa with the African National Congress are all in party. They're all still in power, including ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe, the same person who's been in power for 33 years. So they're sort of hesitant to embrace any sort of change.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you both for coming here today. That's all we have time for. But I don't know if you guys will be around afterwards to chat.
Absolutely.
But yeah, again, thank you on behalf of the Heritage Foundation for
Thank
taking
you.
the time to be here.
Thank you very much.